Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Wednesday, March 2nd, and we will hear the presentation Responding to Climate Change. And this is from a rescheduled date from a few weeks ago, a few Fridays ago. So thanks to all of you for being patient and working with us as we rescheduled this for today. And we're happy to have our panelists here and looking forward to today's session. For your technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the questions box located in your GoToWebinar tool panel, and I will do my best to answer those technical questions. For questions related to the presentation, you can type those again in that questions box. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A portion. I will ask that if your question is for a particular panelist, that you let me know which panelist you'd like to answer. That just helps me filter through all the questions and get through them as quickly and efficiently as possible. So again, if you have any type of questions, either content related or technical, just type those in your questions box and I'll do my best to get to those. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2022. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by the ENRE division, the APA Environmental, Natural Resource, and Energy division. So thanks to you for joining us today. You had your work cut out for you this year with our special credits and just all the things going on. So we're so happy to have you with the consortium and hosting with us today. This screen is slightly out of date because today is the 2nd, but we do have another webcast actually coming up next Wednesday. This is with the International Division, and it's also at a different time. It's at 10 a.m. We're just trying to accommodate some of our international planning friends and the time zone that they're in. So you can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions by heading over to our webcast website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Today's session is worth 1.5 CM credits. It is also worth 1 credit for the new required sustainability and resiliency credit. If you have any questions about this new required credit, if you are AICP, just head over to planning.org/CM. You can get all the details on this new required credit, and it's not the only new required credit. So make sure you head over if you're not familiar, but this is available for that. To log your credits, just again, head over to planning.org, log into your MyAPA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number. Both of those can be found on our webcast website, again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes. I also do my best to try to remind you of the weekly webcast that's coming up. And lastly, we record all of our webcasts and we post them on our YouTube channel. So be sure to subscribe to us so that you get notified when I post a new recording. If you head over there, you'll see that we have well over 350, almost 400 session recordings that are available for you to peruse for free. So be sure to head over there and subscribe to our channel. That's it for my housekeeping items. Again, if you have any questions for our panelists, be sure to type those in the questions box. I'll get those all ready and we'll go through those during the Q&A portion at the end. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Alan. He is our representative from the ENRE division, and he's going to kind of kick things off for us and introduce our speaker. So Alan, I just turned those controls over to you. Yes, I think I did.
Okay.
Yes, I did.
Okay. Full screen. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the Responding to Climate Change webinar. I'm going to briefly introduce our 3 speakers for this afternoon. Our first speaker is David Rouse. David is an urban planner and a landscape architect with 40 years of experience, focusing on creating healthy, resilient, and sustainable communities. David served as a research director for the American Planning Association in Washington, D.C., where he worked closely with nonprofit and federal partners to advance planning practice on topics such as hazard planning and resilience, community health, and planning for autonomous vehicles. David is currently a teacher, author, and consultant, and he will be presenting on the planning of green infrastructure for community resilience. Our second speaker is Darren Punchard. Darren is an urban planning and resilience strategy consultant who has spent his entire career working to prevent natural hazards from becoming disasters. Darren has more than 2 decades of experience in hazard mitigation planning with specialized expertise in risk assessment, risk communications, benefit cost analysis, and the development of actionable strategies for risk reduction. Darren will discuss advancing climate resilience through hazard mitigation planning. Our last speaker is Molly Maui. Molly is the executive director for the nonprofit organization Community Wildfire Planning Center, and she's also the founder of the Wildfire Planning International. For more than 15 years, Molly has been a pioneer in integrating wildfire hazard mitigation with land use planning practices. Molly will be discussing planning and mitigation for wild hazards. And the final thing I have to say for today was that I would like to thank Jim Schwab for connecting us to this great group of people that are going to be presenting these strategies. And with that, I will hand over the presentation to David Rouse.
Thanks, Alan. I got to share my screen here. Do you see it?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
I don't see it. Where's my PowerPoint? Let's see. Sorry, Christy. I'm just trying to figure out how I can see my PowerPoint. I'm just seeing myself.
Perhaps you minimize
maybe
it.
I see something here. Aha.
Okay.
Here's
Did you
the key.
find it?
Okay, good. I started panicking there for a second.
I think now we don't. Oh, there we go.
Yep.
Now you're good.
From beginning.
If you could just put it into slideshow mode. Perfect.
Yep, it should be good. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Alan. And also thanks to APA Ohio chapter and the ENRE division for sponsoring this and inviting me to be a member of this panel. So as Alan said, what I'm going to cover in the next maybe 20 minutes is green infrastructure for community resilience. And I'm going to start by talking about definitions, first of green infrastructure, and I'm particularly going to touch on the co-benefits green infrastructure provides, then resilience. And the bulk of my talk is going to be putting those together, green infrastructure for resilience, in a planning framework. And the framework I'm going to be using is adapted from a model developed by APA, which is called the Strategic Points of Intervention. And you see on the slide here a cover of a book that I contributed a chapter to called the Rutledge Handbook of Urban Resilience. A lot of the material I'm going to be presented is based on that, and you can see I'm also providing a link here at the bottom, and I'm going to be referencing a lot of resources as I go through, and I'll be providing links within the PDF to each of those, each of the references in case you're interested in following up. So you can get, I think you'll be able to get a PDF after the webinar and have access to those materials. So let me move on, start with definitions of green infrastructure. There are two definitions of green infrastructure that are in common usage. The first, older definition, which dates back to the Florida Greenways Commission in the 1980s, refers to a network of open space, parks, greenways, natural areas, and the like, at the scale of a city or metropolitan region. So it's landscape scale green infrastructure. The second, more recent definition refers to stormwater management practices that use vegetation, soil, and permeable surfaces to absorb runoff close to where it's generated. I think this is a definition actually that more people are familiar with and think of when we talk about green infrastructure today. The city and regional open space definition that you see on the screen is from Mark Benedict and Ed McMahon when they were at the Conservation Fund. And the green stormwater infrastructure definition is from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which certainly has promoted this idea of green stormwater infrastructure in recent years. Now, in reality, there's no sharp differentiation between the two definitions. I like to say they form a continuum across geographic scales from the region to the city, district, neighborhood, and site. So this slide shows examples of green infrastructure at the regional and city scales. Moving on to green infrastructure at the neighborhood and site and building scales, here are some examples. On the upper right, you see a constructed wetland in a park in Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia, which is using green infrastructure dispersed throughout the city to address a combined sanitary storm sewer overflow issue, or CSO. In the middle, also from Philadelphia, is a green street. And you can see down at the bottom is a pollinator-friendly green roof planting, which is from the green roof nursery, ENRE Knoll Farms. Now, it's important to note that another thing that unites the two definitions of green infrastructure is the multiple benefits at all scales green infrastructure provides for people and ecosystems. These benefits are often referred to as co-benefits, and they can be organized according to the triple bottom line of sustainability: environmental, economic, and social/equity benefits. And you can see some of these listed on the slide. I'm not going to go through these in detail. I'll point out a couple of points, a couple of these. First, stormwater management is typically the primary reason or direct benefit provided from installing green infrastructure. And that's, as you can see, the first environmental benefit listed. Another environmental benefit, a co-benefit, is from the previous slide, is the pollinator habitat that was provided by the green roof. On the previous slide. So that's an example of an additional environmental benefit provided or co-benefit. And the point is that the more co-benefits provided, the more effective green infrastructure is at building community resilience. Also note that under social/equity benefits, they're particularly evident in the realm of public health. We're very much familiar with the benefits nature brings to health, and they're particularly important from the standpoint of equity and environmental justice. So I'm going to move on to the definition of resilience. The dictionary definition is the ability to become strong, healthy, or successful again. Excuse me?
I'm so sorry.
Oops. Should I keep going? Okay, well, I guess I'll resume. So the dictionary definition of resilience is the ability to become strong, healthy, or successful again after something bad happens. Now, applied to communities, I like the definition that was developed by the Rockefeller's 100 Resilient Cities initiative, which is, you can see on the screen here, is a capacity of a city to survive, adapt, and grow no matter what acute shocks and chronic stresses it experiences. So here's a few examples of shocks and stresses. And note that, like the definitions of green infrastructure, there's really no clear differentiation between what constitutes an acute shock and what's a chronic stress. Just as one example, the COVID-19 pandemic certainly started as a severe shock. It's now transitioning to a longer-term stress as it becomes endemic. Another example, drought is both a shock and a stress depending upon the time frame. So you see in the lower right of the screen, a couple of maps showing extreme or exceptional drought conditions in the US, the first in April 2016 and the second in January 2022. Now, while the exact locations are changing, a couple of conclusions can be made. First, the occurrence of areas of severe drought conditions have expanded over time. They're cover much more of the country in 2022 than in 2016. And second, a number of areas have been experiencing some form of drought conditions for many years. So it's been both a shock and a stress over time. Okay, I've gone through the definitions of green infrastructure and resilience. I'm now going to introduce the planning framework of 5 strategic points of intervention. And this is a model, as I said, developed by APA's research director. And here's an article that was written on it by William Klein, who was my predecessor as research director. And basically, it boils down to key planning activities that leads to positive change in communities. In other words, places where planners can act and their activities can make a difference in promoting resilience or achieving any other planning goal for that matter. So you'll see 2 of the points address plan development. First is community visioning and goal setting. The second is plan making, which covers different types of plans, such as a comprehensive plans and overall framework, functional plans like transportation or green infrastructure. And the next 3 points address plan implementation. Now, a few considerations in using the framework. First, it's important to address multiple types of hazards, both shocks and stresses, and the interrelationships between them as you're trying to build community resilience. The second, as I talked about earlier, is to address multiple scales of concern from the region all the way down to the site or building. The third is to leverage co-benefits to build community resilience that increases the impact of green infrastructure. And finally, prioritize equity. Poor and underserved communities, populations are more vulnerable to shocks and stresses caused by climate change. Now you see on the slide a resource from APA, which was developed with the support of the U.S. Forest Service, which addresses all these considerations in a framework designed specifically for the wildland urban interface, or WUI. And Molly's going to talk more about this in a few minutes. So what I'm going to do now, for each of the 5 points of intervention, I'm going to run through some examples, starting with community visioning and goal setting. Norfolk, Virginia is one of several East Coast cities that are at ground zero for increased flooding from sea level rise and climate change. So they developed a long-range vision plan with community engagement for how Norfolk's going to become a resilient community, the coastal community of the future, as you see on the slide. And that sets the direction for a series of planning and implementation efforts, including the comprehensive plan. They developed a green infrastructure plan in 2018, and they're doing implementation projects, such as a couple you see on the screen here, living shorelines and restored wetlands as strategies to adapt to sea level rise. Moving on to plan making. As I said, different types of plans include comprehensive plans, area plans, and special topic plans. Now, Darren's going to provide some examples of hazard mitigation plans, and Molly, examples of community wildfire protection plans. What you see on the screen is an image from Climate Ready Boston, which is an example of a climate action plan that integrates green infrastructure as a strategy for addressing climate change impacts. Like Norfolk, Boston is projecting severe impacts from sea level rise over the next century. And so some of the strategies are probably hard to see on the slide, but they're showing images in this graphic of what they call a protected and floodable waterfront park, expanded urban tree canopy, and green infrastructure bioswale. So moving on to standards, policies, incentives. We know that long-range planning can have an enormous influence in shaping a community's future. In terms of plan implementation, planners play a key role in conceiving and drafting standards, policies, and incentives that influence what, where, and how things get built. So here's a couple of examples. The first is a guide developed by the National Fire Protection Association on standards to assure safety from wildfire for communities. And again, Molly will talk about this. And on the right, I showed a green street image from Philadelphia earlier, is a manual developed by the city of Philadelphia to implement its Green City Clean Waters long-term control plan, which addresses the CSO issue primarily through green infrastructure. So they're using this manual to develop green streets throughout the city. Moving on to development work, Regulations and incentives are not sufficient in and by themselves to build resilience in new developments through the use of green infrastructure. Green infrastructure needs to work in the market and be integrated into development projects by developers. So here's just a few resources and examples. On the left is from the Urban Land Institute. They've published this guide called 10 Principles for Building Resilience. And Principle 6 is to build the business case. And what they say is that strategies that prepare for and mitigate climate-related risk can create value and provide a strong return on investment. And more you're seeing this in private development work. A couple of examples on the right of the screen. The first is from the Sustainable Sites Initiative. They've developed a rating system which is like LEED for landscapes. And this is a project rated gold under that system. Dell Medical Center at UT Austin. And it has project goals include managing stormwater, reducing water consumption, and increasing landscape resilience. And there are metrics that prove how they are achieving these goals. In a more rural context, finally, on the lower right, is Eco Village at Ithaca, which has been cited by the Landscape Architecture Foundation as one of their landscape performance series case studies. And they've documented using metrics what the impact of this project is in terms of sustainability and resilience. So for example, it retains 100% of runoff on site, reduces irrigation needs by 90%, and sequesters carbon. And there are other benefits documented as well. Moving on to the last and fifth strategic point of intervention is investment in public buildings, facilities, and infrastructure by the public sector. So this is on the left, a publication by the American Society of Civil Engineers on climate resilient infrastructure. And while this obviously emphasizes green infrastructure, since it's a publication for engineers, it also moves, I think, into new realms in terms of thinking how public infrastructure will work, explores concepts of adaptive design and risk management. And I'd like to make I think it's an important point here, is that green infrastructure is not sufficient in and of itself to deal with climate change impacts. We're going to need hybrid gray-green solutions to really deal with all the challenges this is going to bring for cities and communities. So on the right's actually an example of this. This is the Big U project to protect lower Manhattan from flooding storms and sea level rise. It was actually a winner of the post-Sandy Rebuild by Design competition back in, I don't know, 2013 or 2014. And a couple of the features are, you can see on the slide here, a bridging berm to raise East River Park 8 to 10 feet, which is going to protect adjacent development from storm surge and sea level rise, while providing recreational and other community co-benefits. And another gray infrastructure move as part of this project is deployable walls on the underside of an elevated highway that can be lowered to mitigate flooding. And when not in use, the idea is that these panels will be used as canvases by local artists and incorporate lighting and create an inviting community destination. And I should say about $800 million so far has been committed in funding to implement this project. I'm going to close with an example of using green infrastructure to build resilience at the regional scale, specifically the greater Baltimore region of Central Maryland. And this is a plan, a framework that was developed through a Hurricane Sandy Coastal Resiliency Grant. And what this project did was to develop 5 strategies to increase resilience to climate change across the region, at the regional scale, from rural to suburban and urban areas to floodplain areas along the Chesapeake Bay shoreline. And you can see the 5 overall strategies listed here on the right. I'll just cite a couple of them. First is natural resource protection. The idea this is particularly applicable to undeveloped lands with high resource value in more rural parts of the region, for example, forests and wetland systems. And next is urban forest enhancement and restoration, which is particularly relevant to develop suburban and urban communities where the tree canopy provides benefits such as reducing storm water runoff, ameliorating the urban heat island effect, and improving air quality. And the map you see here was developed by the Conservation Fund that led this grant project on behalf of the Greater Baltimore Wilderness Coalition. And what this does is shows opportunities to enhance and restore tree canopy across the region. The best opportunities are in the darkest green color. So I think with this, I'm going to conclude my presentation. Thank you for your attention. We're going to reserve time for questions and discussion at the end, but very quickly, I can't resist putting a plug in for a new book on comprehensive planning. I just wrote with Rocky Piro. It's available from Routledge, and it covers a lot of the concepts I've covered in this presentation are also covered in the book in the context of the comprehensive plan. So again, thank you, and I'll turn it over to Darren.
All right, great. Thank you, David. Hopefully everybody can see me. Christine or somebody, if you can give me an audio. Is my screen showing?
Darren, we can see your screen, but you are not in the slideshow mode yet.
How about now?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, great. Oh. All right, 1 second here. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Hopefully this will work. Yeah, thanks, David. That actually was a great, fantastic presentation, and it really sets up well for some of the things I was going to touch on. You're a tough act to follow, though, my friend. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Al and the ENRE division for the invitation to join you all today. As Al said, the topic I've been asked to speak about is integrating and advancing climate resilience through hazard mitigation planning. And as he said during the intros, I've been working as a planner for about 25 years with a primary focus on keeping natural hazards from becoming disasters. And in that work, I've been fortunate. It's afforded me the opportunity to work with many states and communities across the country on a variety of disaster risk reduction projects. And while they've all developed plans to help prepare for and mitigate natural hazards, my goal today is to share very quickly some examples of how the emerging field of climate adaptation is effectively being integrated into this more traditional, shall we say, longer established practice of hazard mitigation planning. Now, first, when we talk about climate change, many people assume in a lot of circles that we're talking about the future or some future state of conditions that are somehow different from today. However, since my talk is to be focused on the intersection of climate change and natural hazards, let's begin by taking a quick look at our recent history of weather and climate-related disaster events here in the US. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, is our nation's scorekeeper in terms of putting weather and climate into their historical perspective. And according to NOAA's records, since 1980, the US has experienced 310 weather and climate-driven disasters where the overall damages or losses have exceeded $1 billion. Now, some of you have likely seen reports or charts like this one. They come out every year for these billion-dollar disasters, which are recorded for drought, flooding, wildfire, severe storms, and other extreme weather events. Now, the actual costs for many of these individual hazard events greatly exceed that sort of random $1 billion threshold. And in fact, the total cost of all these 310 events over the last 42 years exceeds $2 trillion. More alarming, though, and my reason for sharing this time series chart, is the trend for the annual number of these billion-dollar disasters are clearly, as you can see on the slide, increasing. 2020 set a new annual record with $22 billion disaster events, and 2021 came in very close with 20 events to that record. It's also worth noting that 2021 is the 7th consecutive year in which 10 or more of these billion-dollar disaster events have impacted the US. And the cost for just the last 5 years accounts for more than a third of all disaster costs, all total disaster costs of the last 42 years. Here's a quick look back at 2021, again, for which there were 20 disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion. And in addition to all the physical and monetary damages, these events resulted in the deaths of nearly 700 people and had significant social and economic effects on the areas that were impacted. You can see it included wildfires in the West, flooding and severe weather across many regions of the country, and Hurricane Ida, which caused widespread destruction and catastrophic flooding from Louisiana all the way up to the northeastern US. These events also included the unprecedented and just heartbreaking disasters which took place just last December, including the large tornado outbreak in the central and southern US, and the Marshall Fire that rapidly burned through the Front Range communities in Boulder County, Colorado, which you'll be hearing more from Maui about. But the main point I'm trying to make here right up front is that for many of us in the hazards planning community, climate change and climate-related disaster events are not a future condition or projected scenario of future risk. Climate-influenced disasters are happening now, they're becoming more frequent, and they're happening in locations and during seasons that we really haven't seen before. And they're becoming more severe and widespread in terms of their magnitude and impacts on people, property, and our daily lives. Now, many of you are likely aware that communities have long engaged in planning with natural hazards and public safety in mind. However, the field of hazard mitigation planning, as we know it today, didn't really emerge in the US until the mid-1990s, when FEMA prepared its first ever national mitigation strategy. And several states, including Florida and North Carolina, launched their own statewide initiatives for local hazard mitigation planning. Soon after, the US Congress recognized the need to drive and support this type of planning that would enable communities to better understand and, more importantly, take action to reduce their risks of natural hazards. This shift to focusing on pre-disaster planning was codified through the US Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, which made the creation and adoption of a FEMA-approved local hazard mitigation plan a requirement for certain types of disaster assistance and federal mitigation grants. And in order to maintain that eligibility for that type of assistance, local jurisdictions still need to update and re-adopt these plans every 5 years. So this national status map shows local jurisdictions with approved plans in blue, along with those that have since expired in yellow. And those few and far between gray areas are where there has never been an approved plan, mitigation plan. Today, nearly 25,000 local communities have these FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plans. And the good news is more than 85% of the nation's population live in communities with mitigation plans. So today, many communities are updating their mitigation plan for the 4th or 5th time. I'm not going to spend any time on the federal regulations or standards that FEMA requires to be met in order to receive plan approval. However, I will say that as it relates to addressing climate change, the interpretation of these regulations, as well as the agency's official policies and guidance for mitigation planning, have evolved over the past 20 years. While the regulations do not mention climate change per se, they do make clear that all plans are required to include a fairly descriptive overview and assessment of the probabilities of future hazard events and how those may change in the future. The 2013 Local Mitigation Planning Handbook, which is still today the official guide for planners to develop these plans, encourages the discussion of climate change, especially as it relates to the risk assessment, and it introduces the concept of climate adaptation as a complement to traditional hazard mitigation activities. In more recent years, FEMA and its partners have delivered more specific guidance, online training, and other resources for building climate resilience through mitigation planning. And in fact, I'll say FEMA is currently reviewing and updating its planning requirements and guidance in ways that we expect will make this even more clear for planners in the years ahead. More importantly, though, we are seeing more and more real-world examples of how states and local communities are making this type of integrated planning happen on the ground, where it really counts. So with my remaining time, I'm going to quickly share some of these quick examples and experiences I've had with you, and my hope is that it can help spur some discussion and perhaps lead you to take a closer look at them, as well as similar practices happening around the country. So the first example comes from here in my home state of Massachusetts, where back in 2018, the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan, which we affectionately refer to as the SHMCAP, became the nation's first of its kind statewide plan to integrate a traditional FEMA-approved mitigation plan with a climate adaptation plan at the state level. The impetus for this integrated plan goes back to an executive order signed by Governor Baker in 2016 to better coordinate efforts across the state to strengthen the resilience of communities in preparation for the impacts of climate change. And among the specific directives in that executive order was for the creation of a state-level climate adaptation plan. Shortly thereafter, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, or EEA, and the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency recognized the opportunity to address and the co-benefits of addressing climate change through a collaborative and combined strategy. So in response, it was determined that compliance with the executive order would be met through a comprehensive update to the existing state hazard mitigation plan. This update would not simply incorporate the topic of climate change, but it would rather be driven and framed by how our changing climate is altering everything we thought we knew and understood about natural hazards, and future conditions and long-term disaster risk reduction. I had the opportunity to support the development of the plan, which was led by AECOM and an interagency team comprised of representatives from across state government. It also included a robust outreach and engagement program to incorporate diverse stakeholders from across the Commonwealth in all phases of plan development. And many of these stakeholders brought perspectives and a depth of experience in climate science and adaptation planning, which frankly is often lacking in traditional hazard mitigation planning. To highlight just a few of the notable features of this plan, first, right up front, it acknowledges that climate change is already worsening natural hazards and extreme weather events. And the statewide risk assessment integrated the best available climate science and data for each of the 14 identified natural hazards. And in fact, early in the planning process, it was determined that all hazards included in the plan would become classified and organized according to their primary climate change interaction. So for Massachusetts, this includes changes in precipitation, sea level rise, rising temperatures, and extreme weather. The plan also addresses hazard and climate related vulnerabilities for five key sectors, as you see here on the right-hand side of the slide: populations, government, built environment, natural resources and environment, and economy. The consideration of how climate change may impact these key sectors drove a lot of the risk assessment and decision-making when it came to proposed risk reduction strategies. And also, while there's a tremendous amount of information provided for each individual hazard, including the 9 components you see on the far right side of this slide, one item that worked really well for us was the what I call the rip and run one-page summaries that led off each hazard profile, as you see here. Note how a whole section there under the blue header is dedicated to the potential effects of climate change, as well as key takeaway messages on the exposure and vulnerability of each key sector I just described. Lastly, most importantly, the resulting mitigation and adaptation strategy identified and prioritized more than 100 initial actions to build hazard and climate resilience. We developed an action prioritization tool that helped ensure each proposed action was thoroughly evaluated, scored, and ranked according to some specific criteria that were actually heavily weighted toward long-term resilience to a changing climate. And integrating climate change into the risk assessment provided an opportunity for us to more systematically assess what we refer to as the non-stationarity of and the nature of natural hazards, as well as consider new hazards that may become more of an issue as our climate continues to change. For example, in Massachusetts, you could see invasive species was a hazard that was identified and incorporated into the new plan. Likewise, integrating climate adaptation thinking into the strategy helped drive a lot more focus on building long-term resilience to hazards in ways that, as David alluded to earlier, can maximize co-benefits, but also in avoiding possible what we call maladaptive approaches to disaster risk reduction. In my opinion, this consideration of maladaptation was a huge shift in thinking for hazard mitigation planning. For example, investing in structural protective solutions such as seawalls or dams and levees may be considered by some as a viable mitigation option in the shorter term, but in the long run, they can directly increase the vulnerability by keeping people in harm's way from longer term, intensifying or slow onset climate changes, such as sea level rise, changes in precipitation, and the amplifying effects of those on existing hazards. So just to provide some other good state level planning examples with very little detail, but if you wanted to look at a couple other states, Wisconsin was actually one of the first states to more deliberately address climate change in their state mitigation plan. And this was following some revised guidance that came from FEMA in 2015. That guidance essentially asserted that for a state's plan to continue to be approved, it must include considerations of changing future conditions, including the effects of climate change. However, FEMA left it up to each state to determine specifically how to meet that requirement, and today essentially still does. California has done, of course, a whole lot, as you probably know, with climate adaptation, and in more recent years, they've directly and more explicitly done so through their state hazard mitigation plan, which is very integrated, and again, there's a lot of efforts going on in California separate from that plan, but the plan does a very good job of sort of incorporating that. Maryland continues to do a lot as another example of responding to climate change through their state plan. It's integrated throughout. And North Carolina, very similar to Massachusetts, an executive order was signed a couple of years ago by the governor to develop a climate adaptation and resilience plan, which they've gone ahead and done, but there's a major effort underway beginning right now to fully integrate that with their 2023 plan update process for their state hazard mitigation plan. Now let's switch gears from the state level to the integration of climate change in the local hazard mitigation plans, something that generally has occurred earlier and I'd say more often than state mitigation plans. The small coastal city of Lewis, Delaware was one of the first I'm aware of to do a formally integrated hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan combined nearly 10 years ago. The city of Baltimore, Maryland, provides another great example of an early adopter of this concept. Their initial plan dates back to 2013, and it's seen several updates, but is still maintained as a combined hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan. And today there are many more examples of plans that don't just pay lip service to climate change, but mitigation plans that truly integrate climate's effect on natural hazards and the unique opportunities to address them through adaptation. Boulder County, Colorado's plan is a more recent example I wanted to mention that just in my view does this very effectively, in addition to more deliberately incorporating issues such as social equity and ecological considerations into their risk assessment and mitigation strategy. So these three plans provide some great examples, whether you're looking for a plan for a small community such as Lewis, a large city that's like Baltimore, or a countywide multi-jurisdictional plan such as Boulder County. Now, back in 2013, the plan update for Monterey County, California, was one of the first mitigation plans I worked on that included a primary objective to more deliberately assess the anticipated effects of climate change on natural hazards. This project was a national pilot venture with NOAA and FEMA and the National Association of Counties to showcase the application and value of NOAA's web-based digital coast platform in local resilience planning. And so for those of you working in or with coastal communities, including along the Great Lakes, I highly recommend checking out Digital Coast for its wealth of data, helpful tools, and resources for planners. For example, among the many tools that are freely available through Digital Coast are a variety of mapping viewers, and even better, what are referred to as visualization tools. And for Monterey County, we were able to use such a tool called Canvas to help visualize the potential inundation and impacts from sea level rise, projected sea level rise on local community assets, such as shown in the images here for Phil's Snack Shack. Phil's Snack Shack is a local landmark that everyone in the community was very familiar with, and with very little effort and admittedly very little graphic design skills, we were able to generate these types of very simple images to help drive discussions at public meetings. But they also help the planning team better understand various what-if scenarios that were associated with the maps and the numbers that we often kind of throw at them in terms of projected sea level rise in this case. A more recent example I wanted to quickly share is for Maui County, Hawaii. What's notable about this plan? Well, climate change was a theme addressed throughout the entire update process. And as you can see here, climate change is explicitly and boldly included right in their very brief mission statement and right up front on the actual plan cover. Within the risk assessment, for each individual hazard profile, climate change is integrated, and as well as the mitigation strategy. It's really integrated throughout, both climate changes as well as the adaptation opportunities. Maui's pre-existing Climate Action and Resilience Committee also played a very key role in advancing climate change to be front and center within the plan update. But also the many residents and other stakeholders we heard from throughout the process helped with this. For example, in response to a public survey, more than 75% of respondents during this plan update process indicated that they strongly supported local policies addressing climate change. Such widespread support may not be the case for other communities, but in Maui, it certainly helped us to make the case for climate change being a key focus of the plan. And on a related note, as much as climate science and data informed the planning process, the public outreach and stakeholder engagement efforts were perhaps even more enlightening, in my opinion. We heard from and learned so much from longtime residents on the changes they have observed and lived through. For example, some commented on how the heat during summers was just becoming increasingly unbearable and how living without air conditioning isn't really being considered a safe option anymore. And others said, how they were noticing the more frequent overtopping of certain coastal roadways during normal sunny day high tide events. Lastly, I just want to put in a plug for the Community Resilience Building Framework, or CRB, developed by my friend and colleague Adam Welchel at the Nature Conservancy. The CRB process has been used for what I believe is now over 500 communities across the US in their efforts to begin planning for and building community resilience to hazards and climate. And as noted here on this slide, through a unique anywhere at any scale approach that is driven by community residents and stakeholders. I've enjoyed working with the CRB primarily as it relates to bolstering the public involvement and stakeholder engagement efforts that can directly feed into and inform our resilience planning efforts. Sadly, for many local mitigation plans, in my opinion, this element of the planning process isn't always done that effectively or meaningfully. But I found the CRB workshop approach to be a great plug-in, if you will, to help achieve what really needs to be done in terms of facilitating that more active civic involvement in preparing or updating these plans. Here in Massachusetts, the state adopted the CRB approach for its climate-focused local municipal vulnerability preparedness, or MVP program, with more than 95% of its municipalities having already gone through the planning process. And it's also been incredibly helpful in terms of a tool for facilitating engagement efforts, again, for updating the local hazard mitigation plans elsewhere in the state. So for more information on this, I didn't put the link, but if you just Google Community Resilience Building or go to communityresiliencebuilding.com, I believe you can learn a lot more about this workshop approach. So while this presentation was focused on hazard mitigation plans, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the importance of integrating mitigation and climate resilience into other local community plans. And I know I may be stating the obvious to this audience, but much of this has to do with the unique roles and responsibilities of community planners versus those in other local departments, such as emergency management or public works staff. For example, planners are often tasked with being silo busters. And from what I've seen, when a community's planner or planning department takes a lead ownership role in mitigation or resilience planning, the outcomes are more likely to be integrated with cross-cutting policies and actions identified in these other local plans. And David referred to some of them, the comprehensive or master plans, the small area plans, stormwater plans, and capital improvement plans. But also, and maybe even more importantly, they can result in meaningful changes to the regulatory teeth in the jurisdictions, the local codes, development regulations, and zoning ordinances. And this is notable because one of the admitted weaknesses of multi-hazard mitigation plans is that they've been more narrowly focused on structural engineered projects, those brick and mortar types of opportunities that can hopefully be funded through FEMA mitigation grant programs. But there's obviously a lot of other non-structural activities that planners are very familiar with. And in many cases, these other local plans also are likely to be more holistic in terms of their community resilience and what we refer to as systems-based thinking, with the ability to address societal issues that go beyond hazard risk reduction, such as equity, environmental justice, and so on. So bottom line, it's not just about the mitigation plan. And there's no shortage of guides or resources for planners on this topic of integrating resilience into other plans. I've shared a few here on this screen. If you head to APA's Hazards Planning Center website, all the planning advisory service reports, Maui's been involved in writing several of those. Jim Schwab, who Al mentioned earlier, was in charge of the one you see here on the screen, the dark black one there. That's PAS Report 560, Integrating Hazard Mitigation Best Practices into Planning. It was published back in 2010, but it's as relevant today as ever, and there's some great case studies I'd encourage you to check out. FEMA's Mitigation Planning Resources website has a whole host of publications on this topic of integration. And finally, I wanted to point out Colorado's web-based Planning for Hazards Guide. This is a great one-stop shop that continues to be updated. It was started several years ago, but it continues to be updated routinely with helpful guidance and very practical, proven tools for planners who are looking to address resilience through their routine planning activities, not just through a hazard mitigation plan. So on this final note, I just want to leave you with a quick lesson learned that I like to share while working on the job for the update to DC's comprehensive plan, a 20-year policy document that guides the future growth and development of our nation's capital. Starting out, the objective of DC's Office of Planning was to create a new standalone element, a resilience element for the updated plan, with a focus on addressing the chronic stresses and all the acute shocks that David described earlier that were being faced in the district, notably very much including climate change and natural hazards. Early on in our discussions, though, it was agreed that what was really needed was what some have referred to as a resilience makeover. In other words, we needed to weave resilience and risk reduction strategies throughout each citywide element you see listed here within the plan, and as well as perhaps include a distinct section with the theme of community resilience and sustainability. In the end, however, this effort was so effective at integrating resilience policies and actions into these existing plan elements that there really wasn't much left to include in a separate or standalone resilience themed element. So the lesson, of course, is that the consideration of hazards and climate resilience should be fully baked into each individual aspect of a community's planning and decision-making process. It needs to be a common thread throughout and not a separate objective within its own individual silo. And this includes not being confined to simply the local hazard mitigation plan. So that's it for me. Thank you for the courtesy of your time, and I'm gonna turn it over to Molly now. I've also put my contact info here in case anyone wants to follow up outside of the session. All right.
Thanks, Darren.
Should be heading your way, okay.
Let's see, I don't see you. I don't see it quite yet. Oh, there we go. Can you confirm if you can see my screen? Hey,
Not
Darren.
yet. Hold on. Let me try it one more time. Let me try changing it over for you. Okay, let's see if that works.
All right, how's that?
Looks perfect.
Okay, super. Thanks. Well, again, welcome everyone. Darren, I thought one of your previous slides, I should say, with the quote, I had to write it down. If you were born and raised on Maui, just walking out your front door shows climate change in every way possible. And I personally really related to that with what we'll talk about here for the next 15 or so minutes with wildfire. So I'm based in Colorado. I've been working across the US and Canada, though, for over a decade on wildfire and planning issues. And this photo here, which I'll explain for just a few seconds, is from the Marshall Fire, which happened on December 30th in Boulder County. I'm about 20 miles south of where this is. Unfortunately, it's a familiar scene with my work, but it was shocking in several ways, I think, to many people when this occurred. One was simply the timing. We are not unfamiliar with wildfires, especially across the West, and their wildfires happen across the entire country. But it was the time of year that happened and the set of conditions, which we'll talk about more. So what was unusual was this was on December 30th. There wasn't snow on the ground when this photo I took in mid-February, but there wasn't any snow on the ground. In fact, Colorado, for the Front Range area, which is the urbanized area where Louisville and Superior and Boulder County burned, this urbanized area is, it's a place where it's not unusual to have a wind event. 100 miles an hour wind is what we experienced. But by December 30th, there typically would have been snow on the ground, at least at some point. We had not had much moisture for over 6 months. So these conditions that got set up were the perfect storm, so to speak, with climate change. And unfortunately, we're starting to see more and more of these perfect storm events. So it's leading us to take a step back and say, well, who's really vulnerable to wildfire and how should we be thinking about this? One of the terms that I've been very familiar with in my work, but many planners aren't yet familiar with unless you have experienced wildfire in your jurisdiction, is the wildland-urban interface. All of these photos I took are actually from across the country. And that's one of the key messages I want you to take home today is you may think wildfires and this term, the wildland-urban interface, is a Western issue that you don't really need to worry about if you're not in some remote mountain area. But that's what's really, I think, changed in our planning psyche over the last few years. These photos are from everywhere from Florida to Tennessee to Washington to Oregon, Colorado, and California here, but certainly we have the wildland-urban interface across the entire country. I will point out all of these photos have either experienced wildfire directly or have been evacuated from wildfire. So there's definitely a link when you think about the WUI, think about wildfire. This is not a wildfire risk map or hazard map. This is a wildland-urban interface WUI map. It's put together based on where there's housing and vegetation that come together. So this is a real spatial assessment of the WUI. And I think it's tempting at first glance to say, well, look at all that green non-WUI area in most of the country. Why is the WUI such a big deal? But when you zoom in and you start to see at a finer scale how much of our housing and vegetation overlaps, this is where we think about the WUI. So you get it's spatially defined here, but where we start to get into trouble with the WUI is where all of these conditions exist together, where wildfire hazard would be overlaid with this map. And when a wildfire starts and it enters these more developed areas, which can range from semi-rural to very urban and suburban, which we'll talk about, there's a challenge with how we think about who's in the WUI. And that's, I think, something that's really shifted over the last couple of years is suddenly, I shouldn't say suddenly, but many communities now have been experiencing fire that never thought they were in the WUI, hadn't heard of the WUI, never thought there was a fire problem. And people are kind of saying, why are we burning? What did we do wrong? Well, it's not necessarily what we didn't do wrong, it's just what we haven't been preparing for or thinking about. One of the big factors that has been happening is we've had a significant growth in areas that traditionally have always been considered fire prone. So even areas in the southeast, if you live in Florida or Tennessee, I pointed out earlier, all of these areas in the southeast are quite fire prone. Areas across Texas, Oklahoma, the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. There's really no state that I would look at on this map that is both, doesn't experience any wildfires, and layered on top of that, we've been growing as communities across the U.S. So this map really highlights that the growth rate of homes in the WUI has been expanding over multiple decades. And I'll show this next picture. Again, just to reiterate, all of this development can look very different. We see rural areas, we see suburban areas, we see semi-urban, suburban areas, all as part of the WUI. And one of the challenges associated with this is many of these areas have not been planned or developed with any sort of wildfire in mind. One example is on this first slide, or the first photo on the top. This is a community in the state where I live that we were working with several years ago on this tour and looking at new development and saying, asking what are some of the considerations that the community has to do for fire. Well, there were no type of regulations or any kind of requirements in place for development to occur there. And when we were asking some of the local fire officials, is there water in the area? There's not water in the area. And it would, in fact, he said, to respond if there was a wildfire here, it would take probably over an hour of a brush truck, or a mobile water tender, which is like driving the water in, to respond to this area if it were to become threatened by fire. So we really see this problem coming together across the US. Areas, a set of conditions exist where areas across the country have grown in ways that are not necessarily prepared for fire, but are very much subject to fire. And there's been some significant development in some of the most fire-prone areas. Now, certainly some places have done something about wildfire, but overall, my sense is that we are playing significant catch-up to address the wildland-urban interface, and many communities did not ever think they were in the wildland-urban interface, are waking up to the fact that they actually indeed have a wildfire problem or should be thinking about wildfire. And so the challenges layered on top of that is climate change. And as Darren and David pointed out, climate change is here. I think for so long we were thinking, oh, it's coming, we'll start to see these really bad effects. But I remember early on in my career in the mid or early 2000s watching a presenter talk about, he actually was showing a regional map of future wildfire areas burned in the US, the Western US. And he showed these maps by 2020, by 2060, by 2080, here's how much area would be burning. And it seemed so, I'll admit this, it seems so far-fetched. There's no way all of these areas can be burning that much over the next 80 years. But now we're past 2020 and the climate scientists are saying we've surpassed their projections of what they would see for areas burned. And there's many factors to why things are burning, not just due to climate change. It could be related to landscape health and forest management. But for the purposes of this presentation, climate change is accelerating what the challenges are that we're already facing with all of this development in the wildland-urban interface. One example here is, the precipitation patterns are changing. So what that means is it's not necessarily that we're not getting any rain anymore in the West. It may be that we're getting lots of rain on one day and then no rain for weeks or months. And so we have more extreme events where precipitation occurs, it can be hard for all the water to be properly absorbed in the soil, or during this like quick extreme rain event, grasses can grow up, or there can be a very high growth period followed by a very dry period. So then you have all of this fuel that's just waiting to dry out and become more of an extreme fire hazard. And that's what, when we're working with fire officials across the country, they're really reporting a couple things. One is this extreme fire behavior that they're facing, as well as this fatigue, because it's really an endless fire season. You could argue there never was a real fire season, because we see wildfires occur throughout the year, but generally there was a bit more of a pattern, and now there really is, as we just used this for the Marshall Fire example, no time of year where communities feel like there's a time where they can simply not worry about fire. It's not something I'll go into a lot of detail here, but I do want to emphasize the point that the impacts on communities are vast. Recovery time takes years and sometimes decades. And these are not simply impacts where communities can recover quickly. We are seeing homeowners struggle for years in how to rebuild and get back into their homes and have some level of normalcy. There's certainly loss of life, but the mental health and the social well-being, the toll on people's psyche is very damaging. So even now, the threat of fire in some places has become a really big issue for communities trying to understand what it's like to live with fire in their backyards and feel safe and prepared for it. There's a number of other impacts: air quality, so even those that may not be even in the wildland-urban interface, so you live in a downtown environment, still probably going to be subject to wildfire smoke at some point. There's also, now we're seeing more and more rolling blackouts or service interruptions. So on the one hand, there is an area that we think of as the wildland-urban interface, which again is quite expansive, but truly I think now we're at a point where the effects of wildfire are even more far-reaching than what would be considered the wildland-urban interface. So how do we deal with it? The number one question. So there's a couple ways, there's actually many ways, but I'll highlight the top ones to be thinking about. The first is the most fundamental, thinking about how you can insert planning policies in your core plans. The core plan here would be the comprehensive plan or general plan. California is a bit unique in a good way. They've taken a huge leadership role in saying you are required to add policies into your general plan about wildfire. In the state that I live in, Colorado, there's actually no requirement for counties to even address wildfire hazard. They should, it's a great best practice, but we see some states have taken a far more leadership role in saying, you shall do this. Your general plan is going to have these policies, you're going to think about it. Some of the policies may be to the extent you can avoid new development in high wildfire hazard areas, or what are you going to do to mitigate those impacts? Creating programs that support existing risk or risk to existing development is also key, because not only are we building new developments in the WUI, but we also have to support everything that is in the WUI. This is also where you can plant policy seeds for what will you do after a wildfire, and how will you support vulnerable populations in both planning for wildfire and recovering from wildfire. Darren and David both talked a tremendous amount about how we really can integrate plans. So how would you integrate the general plan with the hazard mitigation plan, and then something else called the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. So if you're not familiar with what a Community Wildfire Protection Plan is, otherwise known as a CWPP, this is a standalone plan. It's not required, in almost all cases, it's not required by law. In any state say you have to adopt this, but it really is a best practice. And it's It can be linked, it can be adopted as part of an appendix to a hazard mitigation plan. But the goal of the Community Wildfire Protection Plan is to focus specifically on wildfire and to think about how a community is going to address the vulnerabilities that they have at different scales to mitigate wildfire threat or to address it in different ways. So you can link this to land use planning policies in your general plan. You can also, one of the things I like to recommend is that don't duplicate this information in every single plan, but make sure these plans really talk to one another. And the worst thing to do would be to have all of these separate maps, and here's a vulnerability assessment here for wildfire, and then here's a risk assessment here, and the two don't talk to each other. So these are 3 key plans to talk about or think about for wildfire policy planning. One quick example where we saw this really shine is Mariposa County, California. We worked with them to work on a community wildfire protection plan last year. And then meanwhile, they were also working on a recreation and resiliency plan, which had a huge focus on climate change, wildfire resiliency, and those 2 plans really linked together. So they were drawing on the same kind of climate information and metrics and actions, and what they were speaking to each other in terms of how can open space and trails and other recreational opportunities support some of the activities that might be mentioned in this community wildfire protection plan. And I didn't include it here, but as I mentioned, in California, they have to look at the general plan with a wildfire filter in addition to many other filters. And so ultimately, these plans, are linked as well to what does the general plan say as a driver for wildfire priorities across the county. I also think it's helpful to think about how when we think about regulating wildfire or regulating for wildfire, what are some of the 3 big scales at which these regulations can occur? I know as planners, we don't always work intimately with the building code, but certainly the building code is a key arena for looking at how we can reduce structure losses in terms of what types of materials or constructions required at that scale. Decks and other attachments are also really key features that the building code should address if it wants to consider wildfire mitigation. An area that we may be more familiar with as planners is with the landscape ordinances or other types of ordinances that would occur or zoning at the scale of a lot. Landscaping is perhaps the most common. Here's an example from Wenatchee, Washington, where after a fire, they did update landscaping requirements, sometimes called defensible space, so that there were changes and the community had to rebuild with certain plants in mind and certain other landscaping techniques. This is also where, in addition to fire-resistant plants or spacing, landscaping ordinances can also consider other types of fire hazards like fences, which may sound very basic to us, but combustible fences are one of the #1 things that I hear, based on science and post-fire analyses, there's a carrier of fire. So one of the best practices now, either in the landscaping ordinance or zoning code or development code, can be as 5 feet of non-combustible fencing if it's attached to the structure. So instead of having stockade privacy fences or other types of wooden fences, having that 5 feet connection that disrupts the continuity of fire coming to the house can be very effective. And then subdivision regulations. I mentioned the community that is allowing development without any water or access requirements. Well, on the approval end of subdivisions is where we can really see some of those standards for access and water supply be factored in. In terms of what are we going to require so there's safe ingress and egress, there's safe evacuation. It allows for more effective fire protection from first responders. There's many other things I could talk about here, but I know just in the interest of time, I'll keep moving on. One of the other things to consider is that sometimes regulations or strategies will look different based on the type of development patterns and density. So one thing we're hearing about more in the planning world, which gives me a little bit of heartburn, I should say in the fire world, but as a planner, it gives me some heartburn, is structure separation. So because some homes are so close to each other, you know, the idea of potentially separating structures more, having larger lots, means that home-to-home ignition wouldn't occur during a wildfire, which, yes, scientifically, that could be the right approach. But from a long-term climate change, adaptation, sustainability perspective, having larger lots in all cases and just extending the separation between houses is not, in my mind, the best solution necessarily. And so I think we need to weigh many different factors, whereas I know what the wildfire mitigation requirements are, there's a bigger context in which we have to think about what's ultimately going to be a short-term fix. So we're reducing risk to these houses, but long-term, we're not creating more carbon emissions by, you know, homes necessarily requiring more roads and longer distances between travel points. So I think this speaks to the complexity of some of the issues that we face, both in the short term of adaptation or mitigation and the long term. I heard this term the other day, the transformation of our communities, so we're not continuing to feed the cycle that we're in. Just wanted to speak for a minute on the importance of post-disaster recovery. Many communities we see do have in place, either beforehand or immediately after a fire, some type of emergency or urgency ordinance. These are really helpful for quickly being able to clear out debris, allow for temporary housing, expediting permits for rebuilds. One of the cautions here is the positive thing about doing this in advance before the fires, it really gives you the opportunity to think through how you'd want to rebuild. And, you know, the situation many communities we work with face is, we just experienced a fire, we didn't have any requirements in place. Now we know we should, but we don't want to overburden communities or community members who are rebuilding with something that's very expensive for a new mitigation requirement. So doing all of this in advance is so much easier is a relative term here, than waiting until after the fire and then being perceived as trying to put more onerous restrictions on when the rebuild is happening. So again, thinking about how long-term adaptation to climate could bake in what we can do now to be more proactive. So when the opportunity for rebuilding comes, we're rebuilding in a more resilient way without the tensions of, you know, people wanting to get back to normalcy. So in fact, you know, how do we change normalcy now for a better normal future? Collaborate. My life is really bringing planners and fire professionals together in the same room to talk about these discussions. I would say if you don't know your fire department or fire marshal or fire chief, if you don't know the fire protection districts, you definitely should have those relationships. We as planners can't do this alone. I'll never know a fire code as intimately as a fire marshal. As a fire marshal, we'll probably never know a zoning code as intimately as we do. So I think having those linkages is key for solving this problem. There are other professions too, foresters, landscape architects, builders, so many more folks that we work with, but that core connection between fire and planning is really important. Just a quick couple of resources if you're really interested in this topic. As David mentioned, we did a lot of work with APA. Several years ago, we had this publication, Planning the Wildland Urban Interface. I think it's still very relevant. And then we did some specific research on 4 states, California, Colorado, Montana, and Washington, that, you know, again, helping other states as well as these states look at what kind of frameworks are in place related to the buoy. So I thank you so much for your time. I hope this was helpful in terms of maybe planting some seeds for how you can better be thinking about your community in the buoy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Molly. We have a lot of great questions coming in. If my fellow panelists wouldn't mind turning their webcams back on, I am going to, perfect. Thank you, Molly. Great. Hey, everybody. All right, we're just gonna dive in, so buckle up. Let's see how many of these we can get through. The first question is a doozy. And this one is for anyone, so we'll see who picks this up first. Our stormwater managers are anti-green infrastructure for neighborhoods, citing the likelihood that homeowners won't maintain them properly. Has anyone seen a handbook or program that addresses maintenance of green infrastructure by private citizens or organizations? And I would guess I would start with, are you aware of this as an issue with green infrastructure and private citizens? So let's start there. Is it an issue? Can it be an issue? What generally are the issues that you'll see? And then where do we go from there? Anyone want to?
Yeah, I'll
start.
I don't
David?
know that I have
Okay.
a good answer, but I did start talking about this topic. And for as long as I've been working on green infrastructure, this is the number one issue that comes up is maintenance. How do you maintain green infrastructure? And it's generally perceived as a problem, and I understand the situation you're talking about, but we need to kind of flip the scale, or I'm not sure if that's the right term on this, but look at it a different way. Because gray infrastructure, maybe it doesn't cost as much right now because it's out of sight, out of mind, but the life cycle costs of gray infrastructure are much higher than the life cycle costs of green infrastructure. If you think about the cost of installing, maintaining over time, and then at the end, particularly with gray infrastructure, the enormous capital costs of replacing it. The other thing is that green infrastructure, as I said in my presentation, provides these different benefits for the community, and citizens are aware of these benefits. The residents, like to have contact with nature, have recreational opportunities, etc. So there are the benefits that are provided that gray infrastructure doesn't provide, conventional stormwater management, and there are many examples of communities that are doing this, by the way. So I'm sure one of those communities can provide guidance. But the last thing I'll mention is the economic benefits and the job opportunities that are provided by the maintenance. So it's not just a cost, it's an opportunity to provide meaningful employment. There are training certification programs for residents and citizens around green infrastructure. So I think there's a lot of reasons to say maintenance isn't a problem, it's an opportunity when it comes to green infrastructure.
I like the way you turned that around as an opportunity. Anyone else have any comments on that? No, we're good. Okay, Darren, this next one is for you. How can environmental justice be incorporated into the local hazard mitigation planning process to protect vulnerable and disadvantaged communities? And while you're thinking about that, before I forget, we have had several sessions in the past, even recently as last year, regarding environmental justice. So make sure you head over to our YouTube channel and just search environmental justice on our channel, and you'll come up with some really recent and relevant sessions regarding environmental justice. Okay, Darren, you're up.
Yeah, no, and I think, Christine, you know, that kind of goes to what I was going to say. Is that fortunately now there are so many best practices and things on this topic that are being implemented. So I'll cite one example, but you're starting, as you said, to see more resources coming out. There's no one size fits all approach that goes with any type of outreach or engagement and planning, of course. Something that's worked well here I mentioned the Massachusetts MVP program. There's a whole environmental justice and equity toolkit that has been developed after their couple years in this program. And one example, for example, they were having a real difficult time engaging with representatives, people from the environmental justice communities in Massachusetts municipalities. And what they've actually done is helped fund through grant program. Again, sometimes it comes down to money or cash or other incentives, but they actually have liaisons. So there's the local planning team and their stakeholder meetings and things. But as I've learned, and I touched on civic engagement lessons learned during my presentation, it's very difficult for people to come to you. You need to go to them. And what these liaisons, these environmental justice liaisons, have been successful in doing here in Massachusetts has been, they've been going to them. They've been serving as a bridge. They're actually paid volunteers, if you will, but they're actually getting paid to serve as a neighborhood liaison or work with directly an environmental justice community to make sure that they're engaged early and often and throughout. And the measure of success and how that works, I think, is in the resulting plan, obviously. The outreach and engagement can be measured different ways, but if their the way that they're being impacted, these vulnerable populations, and how they're going to better adapt or address resilience specific to them, if that's reflected in the plan, I'd say it's a success.
Okay, thank you. This next one, let's go with you, Molly. Let's see. Mitigating new development in high wildfire hazard areas. You had mentioned that. Does that mean to reduce the vulnerability? And if not, can you give an example of what you mean by mitigate new development in high wildfire hazard areas?
Sure, that's a great question, and apologies if that term was confusing. It's one I use so often I forget sometimes. So what I mean by mitigating in this case is finding strategies or ways to reduce the susceptibility of development if it were to be threatened by wildfire. And that may look like a couple of the things I mentioned, making sure that the types of plants being used are fire resistant, that they're spaced away from a house. The type of building materials use ignition resistant construction is what we call. So this is all with the idea that if embers that were created during a big wildfire land in some close proximity to this property, that those embers would not have the opportunity to ignite and then turn into some kind of small flame or threat to the structure, or land in the gutters, land in the vents. So that's really, it's lessening the potential impact that fire threat can have on development.
Okay, well, while we have you and while we're defining things, if we could talk a little bit about WUIs and how you define it. And the question says, in my region, we've been hearing that there isn't a standard definition for the area of the WUI. And we're having conversations about whether it's all the area within a certain distance of a structure or defined some other way.
Mm-hmm. It's such actually a tough question, because it is true. There's two ways to think about the WUI. One is a spatial definition, and spatial definitions are usually grounded in X number of housing units and X type of density of vegetation. And that combination of the vegetation or the proximity of homes to vegetation is a very easy way we can spatially define the WUI. However, when we delineate the WUI in a spatial way, it sometimes gives the sense that there are areas that simply won't be prone to wildfire. And what we're actually seeing is that it's really a set of conditions where any development that has a set of conditions that allows for fire to burn through this built and natural environment is an issue. And so we challenge communities to really think about, yes, you can have a spatial definition, but ensure that it is broad enough to capture even this sort of moderately rated areas that don't seem to be as subject to high wildfire hazard. So happy, and again, I'm going to hold this up. We talk about this a lot in this book. So, and it's free for planners. It's 100 pages. So if you really want to dig into it, this is really a great resource to help understand the WUI and those concepts.
Thank you. David, the Baltimore Regional Plan, was it adopted by the communities that it covers?
That's a very good question. This was a grant project that was funded actually by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, money provided from the Department of the Interior. So it was more of a top-down process. Basically, this great tranche, if that's the word for it, of funding came through to support communities post-Sandy and building resilience. And this is one of the very few planning grants. It was led by the Conservation Fund. And the organization leading it, I mentioned it, the Greater Baltimore Wilderness Coalition, which was modeled after the Chicago Wilderness, was the first one of these organizations. But it's an informal collection of agencies, municipalities, state, federal agencies, nonprofits, et cetera. American Planning Association was involved in the grant, which is how I started working on it. So it didn't really have any legal foundation, or that say if a municipality adopting it. So what we tried to do was work with municipalities, counties in the region to adapt these practices into their codes, their capital improvement programs, et cetera. So that process is still going on, but it's one of collaboration, as Molly talked about. And it's actually several years after the fact, and more than that now, 2016, I think the plan was done. It's starting to gain momentum, and there's more grant money coming in. There's a major tree planting grant now for the Baltimore region. So again, it's one of partnership and collaboration rather than, I forget the original question. I think it was about whether it was adopted officially by communities. It's actually not adopted officially by anybody, which is interesting.
Okay, thank you. Darren, there are, this question is the increase in the number of billion-dollar disasters impacted by an increase in populations living in hazardous areas? I'm sure there are a whole host of things that contribute to how these, how impactful these disasters are. But can we say that growing populations in hazardous areas can be one of the larger influencers?
The short answer is yes. I think that can be safely assumed. I'm vaguely familiar with NOAA's methodology and the costs, how they go and gather that information, but I don't think that's actually been studied, but I would say that it's, yes, more than likely that certainly I would imagine being a factor.
Speaking of methodology, I'm going to stick with you. This question says, I'm interested in seeing an online tool that planners can use to identify the likelihood of types of risk. For example, a Category 5 hurricane has historically landfalled. I guess, are you aware of open source programs or maybe free or not so free resources to help communities determine their level of risk?
Again, short answer, yes. Much of it depends really where you are. Various states have incredible programs and invested in a lot of data collection and have online mapping viewers. Nationally, many people may or may not be familiar with FEMA's loss estimation software called HAZUS, Hazards of the United States. It's been around for a long time, continually investing in. That helps in a lot of ways I won't get into, but users, specifically those who want to get into the GIS kind of side of things and doing some fairly sophisticated analysis, can go through different levels of that. Out of the box, it's a useful tool for loss estimation purposes. There's a whole lot more that can be done, and that's free. You have to have the ArcGIS platform, but again, it really depends where you are. There is a lot. I mentioned Digital Coast. NOAA's Digital Coast, even if you're not a coastal community, incredible tools and resources and online free mapping viewers and things that have just been incredibly helpful to me and other communities I know for hazard planning and modeling. And I should say, in each mitigation plan, one of the FEMA requirements is to do that type of analysis and assessment. So in looking at neighboring mitigation plans, I'd encourage you to look at what were the sources that they use, or even the state has a mitigation plan, because there are a lot of sources out there and they're growing.
Darren, are you familiar with the National Risk Index map? Is that a useful tool as well that FEMA has?
I'm familiar with it. Short answer is I think it depends. At a higher scale, I think it's useful. I found at the local scale some issues just with what you usually find with aggregated data sets that you try to get down to a more localized scale. But that's another one. Good. Thank you for raising that, Molly, because it can be very powerful depending on where and how you're using the National Risk Index.
Okay, guess what, guys? It's time to wrap up. This has been really fun. Real quick, the people want to know, Molly, how can APA members access the free resource, the book?
Well, you can go to communitywildfire.org, and under resources, you can link to the APA. You do have to sign in, or if you aren't a member for some reason, You just have to create a free membership, but it is free. And if you have any problems accessing it, contact us through our website and we're happy to share.
Yeah, it's available in Planning Advisory Service PS reports on the website. And you're right, Molly. I think it's free. I had thought about it's free for non-members as well as members because it had grant funding. The U.S. Forest Service has been a terrific supporter of APA on all this work.
Wonderful. Well, thanks to all of you, and thank you to the ENRE division today. I appreciate all of you. You all know what you're talking about, that's for sure. And I appreciate all the work that you do and for joining us today. And thank you, Alan, on behalf of ENRE for hosting us. Folks, as a reminder, we're recording the session. We'll post it up on our YouTube channel. If you're having trouble remembering the title or the event number and logging your credits, just head over to our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, and you'll see all that information up there. And don't forget to register for our upcoming sessions. All right, everybody, have a good rest of your week, and we'll talk next time. Bye-bye.